This was the summer of 1862, 6 months before Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation. Horace Greeley was publishing pious editorials, wondering why it was taking Lincoln so long to free the slaves, and all the while, Lincoln was ordering the emancipation of thousands of slaves in the lower Mississippi Valley. Further up the Mississippi River, Generals Ulysses Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman were even more hesitant about emancipation than Butler was. At first, they implemented the Second Confiscation Act only to the extent of allowing slaves into their lines and putting them to work for the Union Army, but they did not assume that the slaves had been emancipated. Lincoln's preliminary proclamation of September 1862 set them straight. It quoted extensively from the provisions of the Second Confiscation Act that freed all rebel-owned slaves in Union-occupied areas of the South, which encompassed the areas under the control of Generals Grant and Sherman. Within days, the War Department printed 15,000 copies of Lincoln's preliminary proclamation and distributed them through the Army as General Orders Number 109. Grant and Sherman got the point. They are free, Sherman finally admitted to his wife, actually, in the fall of 1862. The President declares the Negroes free. Grant agreed. In November, he assigned Chaplain John Eaton to oversee the transition from free to free labor among the newly emancipated slaves in the areas under his control, the heavily populated plantation districts along the Mississippi River north of Vicksburg. During those same months, in late 1862, Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton instructed Union generals in Arkansas to emancipate all slaves coming within their lines. Now let's listen one last time to the way political and military officials were talking about slavery in the year before the Emancipation Proclamation. Listen to Lincoln explaining to Congress in late 1862 that numerous slaves were coming into Union lines and were, quote, thus liberated. To Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase, replying to a Sea Island planter who asked him about the status of his slaves. They are free, Chase told him. To General Sherman, making the same declaration in 1862, they are free. The President declares the Negroes free. And to General Butler, explaining to his officers in Louisiana that, quote, by the act of Congress, they are clearly free. All of these emancipations were initiated by the Lincoln administration implementing congressional statutes before the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863. Which brings us to the question of the hour: what did the Emancipation Proclamation actually do? If the federal government had been freeing slaves for nearly a year and a half, if tens of thousands had already been emancipated, what changed after Lincoln issued his proclamation? We know what it did legally. Legally, the proclamation implemented the policy adopted by Republicans in the Second Confiscation Act, making emancipation universal in the seceded states. The Union had been freeing slaves in areas it occupied. It would thereafter free slaves in unoccupied areas of the rebellious states. Section 6 of the law required a presidential proclamation for that part of emancipation, that extension of emancipation to be implemented, and that's what the Emancipation Proclamation did. But how? How could the president effectively emancipate slaves in areas over which his army had no control? He would do so by changing military policy on the ground in two distinct ways, one of them well known, the other almost completely unknown. First, Lincoln's proclamation authorized the systematic enlistment of blacks into the Union Army. Everyone knew that for slaves to be freed, the Union had to win the war. If the Confederacy succeeded in establishing its independence, slavery would go on forever. Black soldiers would help prevent this. In the struggle to suppress the Southern Rebellion, Lincoln said, black troops did double duty. Every slave recruited into the Union Army deprived the Confederacy of his labor and added the same amount of labor to the strength of the North. Lincoln eventually concluded that black soldiers were, quote, indispensable to Union victory in the war, which meant they were indispensable to the destruction of slavery. That's one of the reasons it made sense for Lincoln to make his announcement of black enlistment in the Emancipation Proclamation. But there was another reason as well. Lincoln and the Republicans believed that service in the Union Army ensured that a soldier who had been a slave could never be re-enslaved. Remember Trumbull's warning. Nobody could be absolutely certain that slaves freed during the war were in fact freed forever. But most Northerners were sure that you could never revoke the freedom of a former slave who risked his life for his country by enlisting in the Union Army. Enlistment guaranteed emancipation. This is one of the reasons black enlistments were highest in states that were exempted from the Emancipation Proclamation, states like Tennessee and Kentucky. For slaves in those states, enlistment was the surest path to irrevocable freedom during the Civil War. We know a great deal about the history of black soldiers during the Civil War, but we know almost nothing about enticement, the second major policy change instituted by the Emancipation Proclamation. In fact, we know so little about enticement that I'd be willing to wager that hardly anybody in this room, if anybody at all, knows what it means to say that the Emancipation Proclamation lifted the ban on enticement, except Scott, because he read the book. If you read the book, yeah. You might be able to guess what it means, but I'd be surprised if any of you really know, unless, as I said, you read the book. What did it mean to lift the ban on enticement? To answer that question, we have to understand something else about Union policy before emancipation. So let's go back one last time to Fortress Monroe and take a closer look at precisely what Lincoln's cabinet authorized General Butler to do on May 30th, 1861. In his telegram to Butler shortly after the cabinet meeting adjourned that day, Secretary of War instructed the general to keep all contrabands who come within Union lines, but otherwise to leave the peaceful operations of slavery alone. That same distinction was repeated in the August 8th instructions for implementing the First Confiscation Act. Union soldiers were authorized to emancipate slaves coming into their lines, but were forbidden to entice slaves away from their owners. Over the course of the next year and a half, Union authorities maintained the same basic distinction. As John Hay, one of Lincoln's secretaries, put it in September of 1862, the government's policy was, quote, not to return to slavery those slaves who fall necessarily into our hands in the course of the war. But Union soldiers, Hay wrote, were, quote, not to entice them in, nor to incite them to rise. On December 17th, 1862, 2 weeks before the proclamation, General Grant ordered his superintendent of contrabands to employ, quote, any Negroes who voluntarily come within the lines of your army. But in no case, Grant added, quote, will Negroes be forced into the service of the government or be enticed away from their homes except when it becomes a military necessity. That was the ban on enticement, the ban that was lifted by the Emancipation Proclamation. John Nicolay, Lincoln's other secretary, explained the new policy on January 2nd, 1863. Where am I?
January 2nd.
The day after, okay. John Nicolay, Lincoln's other secretary, explained the new policy on January 2nd, 1863, the day after the proclamation. Henceforth, Nicolay said, the slave population will be used to suppress the rebellion, quote, as rapidly as it can be brought within Union lines. Quote, it is the policy of this government, General-in-Chief Henry Halleck explained to Grant in March, quote, to withdraw from the enemy as much productive labor as possible. Union troops must never, quote, discourage the Negroes from coming under our protection. This is not only bad policy in itself, Halleck explained, quote, but is directly opposed to the policy adopted by the government. The character of the war has changed, Halleck added. The policy now adopted by the government is, quote, to withdraw from the use of the enemy all the slaves you can. The War Department's Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas explained the new policy in the spring of 1862 in almost the same terms, quote, they are to be encouraged to come within our lines. Now, Lorenzo Thomas was the most well-known and influential Union officer engaged in the systematic enticement of slaves, but there were others operating in many parts of the Confederacy, and by the end of the war, the Union Army had assigned 237 soldiers to duty as emancipation agents whose sole purpose was to go onto farms and plantations and encourage slaves to leave their owners. James Ayres was one of those agents, and his remarkable diary gives us a vivid account of just how enticement worked on the ground. I'm going to quote extensively from Ayres' diary, but I need to warn you in advance that although Ayres was a minister and a devoted abolitionist who hated slavery, he was a 19th century man who used 19th century language, much of which is offensive to us. But to censor his words would be to destroy the effect of his diary. Here's his entry for May 7th, 1864. On that day, Ayres rode onto a plantation 10 miles outside of Huntsville, Alabama, and into a field where 27 slaves were gathering corn. Whose farm is this? Ayres asked. Master Eldridge's, sir. Is that his house yonder? Yes, massa. Is he good to you? Not mighty good, massa. Is he a Union man or a secessionist? After telling Ayres that their master, quote, swears and cusses at the Yanks terribly, the slaves went back to work lest their master, quote, flog us if he sees us idle or whip us for talking to you. Ayres reassured them, quote, I've come to tell you good news, he said. Father Abraham has declared you all free. You have no master now. You are free, and I have come to tell you. Getting down from his horse, Ayres began to read from a card announcing that, quote, all slaves were made free men by Abraham Lincoln, and urging, quote, able-bodied colored men to come to the nearest Union camp to fight for the Stars and Stripes. Ayres made the pitch. The Army would pay $10 a month plus food and clothing, and make you free if you will enlist and be soldiers. How many of you boys will turn out? Ayres asked. When do you want us? Want you right now. Oh, massa won't let us go. Never mind your master, Ayres protested. You have none. Ayres then rode up to the house where he understood there were other potential recruits, and there he met the Eldridge family, quote, Master, Mrs., and the gals. How do you do, Ayres said. Fine day this is. Yes, Mr. Eldridge answered. What's all this mean? My niggers say you come into this field to set them all free. Is that so? Yes, sir. Well, I'd like to know how you got the authority to do so, sir. By the War Department, sir, I get my authority, the very best authority, ain't it? What do you want with my niggers? Eldridge demanded. Your niggers, Ayres replied. You've got no niggers, my dear sir. These are all free men, as you or I am. And these women here that have been your slaves are all free. So much so as this lady. Eldridge then invited Ayres to leave, but the recruiter was hardly finished. Leave, Ayres said. Why, sir, I'll leave when I get ready. But I'm going to take your men, or these men, when I go. You may bet your eyes on that. Ayres then drew his revolver and continued the lecture. Mister, one of Eldridge's daughters interrupted, are you going to take Dad's niggers away from him, whether or not they're willing to go? Well, no, ma'am, I ain't, Ayres replied, but I'll tell you what I am going to do. In his experience, Ayres explained, he had found it best to walk off with the young black men a half a mile or so and, quote, have a big talk with them to see if he could persuade them to enlist in the Union Army. Those he, quote, can't coax would be free to go back. Eldridge's daughter next suggests that Ayres allow her father to speak with the men before they walked off, but Ayres thought that was a bad idea. He had his solitary chat with the men, and when he left, he had 6 blacks recruits with him. Shortly thereafter, they enlisted in the 15th Tennessee Colored Regiment, based in Nashville.